this lecture is now being recorded, and we're going to dive right in. So today we're going to be starting JavaScript, which should be exciting. I know. A couple of things, but I want to spend this time to be introduce you to JavaScript, give you a sense of what you should expect in this cohort, in this this phase, and kind of really spend some time digging into what you're going to be learning, how you can best prepare yourself to be in JavaScript, and then eventually we're going to be starting to touch off on how to use the DOM. So this is ostensibly the intro to the DOM lecture, but it's going to be a lot of intro to JavaScript first. But before we get started with that, I'm Nikki Dover. That's me. I'm right here. In this picture, this is what I looked like before beard, before the pandemic, when I remembered to shave regularly. So I can't guess what I'm singing there. I forget, but I would, if you had to give me a 50-50, I'd say it was Queen. That being said, if you want my whole karaoke playlist, you can hit me up. My pronouns are he, him. I am a Flatiron grad. So I went to the program, in the in-person program, way back in February of 2019. It then basically immediately got a job as a coaching, as a coaching role. Before that, I did 5 years as a public relations consultant. One thing that is clearly missing here, I have not had production level coding experience. So I will be very open and honest with that. I will tell you, hey, here's what I've heard from people in dev. I've had a ton of students who have gone on to do production level coding. But if you want to know hey, what's this like in prod? I'm going to give my answer from the best of my ability. And I would love to also forward that answer on for you. I'm a huge nerd. I apologize for that. There's going to be a lot of references that that will annoy you. I'm from New York City. And that's going that also will happen a lot. I think I just moved. So this used to be my sister's bedroom, and she was my roommate. I live with my girlfriend in the other room. She moved out to do a really cool fancy pastry chefing job. So so now this is my office. So you won't hear as many sirens and yelling and weird things, because this is just a courtyard. Until the rats start acting up and become sentient and build robots, I think we're good. And I'm also your cohort lead. In terms of things that you should know in terms of how I like to run things, I'm available from 11 to 7:30 via Slack. Hit me up on Slack first. That's going to be the quickest way I'll respond. I don't check my email. I always say this is the week that I start checking my email, and then I'm lying to myself. I will try my best, but hit me up on Slack if you have any questions at any hour of the day. You can trust those answers between 11 and 7:30. After that, I'm either half asleep, I'm with friends, I'm doing something, I'm invested in Love Island, which I've only seen the first episode of so far, so please do not spoil it. And so you might get a more unusual answer after that, or I might just ignore you. But from 11 to 7:30, Monday through Friday, hit me up if you have any questions on Slack. You should already have added your Google Calendar from Canvas to your personal Google Calendar, or set that up if you can. I would really highly recommend that. That's where I'm just going to drop office hours and one-on-ones and pods. And usually I won't even really warn you about that. I expect the calendar is really going to be the source of truth there. In terms of other things, I have a booking link for scheduling one-on-ones. That has a bunch of slots. Those slots don't work for everybody. I understand that. I don't want to open up my entire day to just free slots. But if you can't find a slot during that section, hit me up and I will find you a slot. Ideally, this within the next 3 or 4 days. I welcome one-on-ones. Currently, we are doing a combination of office hours and one-on-ones. We don't really have any regular pod set up because I think we found that scheduling wise didn't work. We have an algo club that we occasionally do. The next one is next week, where we go about hacking together some algorithms. That'll be next Wednesday. I might do some other clubs depending on what we're interested in. If there's anything you want to go over that wouldn't make sense in a regular lecture, but you'd want me to dive into for an hour, just let me know, and I would love to schedule that. In terms of the actual process, I think that basically covers everything. Tell me your feedback. I do not have an emotional attachment to my lecturing style. You can tell me hey, this was too fast, this was too slow, this didn't make sense. I don't never saw that movie, so none of that made sense. All of those are acceptable pieces of feedback, and I welcome them and cherish them. So feel free to DM me. I do not put my ego on how well I lecture. Cool. Apart from that, I'm trying to think if there's any other major things. I'm going to try to keep making sure that the Slack channel is where you get all of the. I'm going to upload it to Canvas once I've made my decision on it. I think I might, for those of you who are repeating, I might change some lab schedules, which might not matter to you anyways. You might be like, hey, I'm not going to redo those labs. But I might reorder them somewhat. I have a very strong opinion that object-oriented JavaScript is taught too late in this phase. And so I'm going to be reordering some of the curriculum based on that, to make sure that it doesn't just ambush you at the end and then is one of the main requirements for your project. I have a very strong opinion on teaching object-oriented development. I think it's an art, and I want to spend as much time on it as possible. But I will put a tentative list of what you should prepare for the labs on Canvas as soon as possible. Otherwise, I try to put a screenshot at the beginning of the week in Discord, in Slack, not Discord. That would be exciting if I was just like randomly messaging some Discord friends about this too. Just teaching an entirely separate curriculum to like a bunch of gamers. So that I think covers off on most of the logistics. If I ever forget to do something, whether it be upload a lecture video or drop one of those things, the list of like the curriculum for the week or something like that, please feel free to DM me. I once again will not feel judged for this. I have ADHD, deal with it a lot. And one of those things means occasionally forgetting something 3 steps into it. So please hit me up. Also, if you have ADD, feel free to talk to me about strategies and stuff. I love talking about that. I think that covers off on anything. Do you have any questions on who I am? With regards to like the logistics and stuff. Cool. Yeah, that's fair. I also realized when I said that was way too broad and a dangerous like path to go down. But we're going to start with what to expect when you're JSing. So for those of you who are new to JavaScript, what have you heard about the program? And then those of you who are coming back to it, I will give you an opportunity to give your experience and what you thought. Well, it's very difficult for sure.
I think it's like object oriented, right? For what I saw until now.
Interesting. It's got some object oriented elements. Those are relatively new. I'm going to talk a little bit about them. It originally was much more functional and it's been moving towards an object oriented language. That being said, the word object means a lot in JavaScript, and we're going to be talking about that for a long time. Other things I've heard, it's the wild, wild west is one of the phrases I hear a bunch. It's cursed. It's very difficult. There's a couple of other hopefully good things that you've heard too. Like it's important to know in order to get a job. I think is a big one. But like for sure. Okay, first things first. If you have said the word Java to refer to what we're learning right now, stop doing that altogether. We are not learning Java. JavaScript was named JavaScript because in 1994, they thought that would make it sound appealing because Java was a fun language that other people knew. It has nothing to do with Java, and they're two very different languages. So just know that, like, get in the habit, if you ever say Java, that's not like a fun abbreviation. That's something that will get you thrown out of a meetup. Cool. But in terms of, it's very difficult. It's very weird. It's kind of cursed. It's the wild, wild west. It's object oriented. I want to talk a little bit about all of those things. So first off, I just want to like bring up one thing about being difficult. This mod is faster. And this, I know this sucks. This is one of, I'm not going to be dishonest. For some people, I like the JavaScript mod. I got it. Don't worry. Most people find this to be one of the more difficult mods, or the most difficult phases. I didn't update the slide to say phase instead of mod. But a couple of different reasons. One, it's the whole, like, it's how the whole of front end coding works, right? But like also, like, so there's a lot of material to cover. That's definitely part of it. But I think the larger part of it is kind of on us. I think where you went into Ruby, we basically spent the first phase kind of discussing the very basics of it, like how to iterate over an array, how to like write stuff down and get a return statement, how to just manipulate different data types and how to use different methods. In this case, in JavaScript, we're not really going through that. There's some labs that are going to talk a little bit about what the differences between declaring functions in JavaScript are and declaring methods. There's going to be some labs on array methods or functions, which I'm going to start using. Eventually, there will be like a little swear jar for every time I say method as we teach JavaScript, functions now. Basically what you're expected to do is do a lot of the Googling on your own. So I've mentioned this before to those of you who have been in my cohort, that learning a new language in coding isn't like learning a new language in real life. Like me knowing English doesn't mean I can go start applying for jobs as a Spanish speaker, right? I can't do that. But if you know Ruby Rails, you can go ahead and apply for a Python Django job despite never having used that language. And you will probably get it if you're a good enough Ruby Rails developer. And there's a reason for that. A lot of coding languages are very similar, and JavaScript and Ruby, in terms of the methods themselves, can be similar in terms of what we do with them. In terms of like the crazy stuff that we can do with functions in JavaScript, we can't do a lot of them in Ruby. Ruby is much more disciplined regarding object orientation than JavaScript, which will just allow you to like throw around functions, have other functions call those functions, define a function inside of a function, and things like that. So for all of those things, when we get to the things that make JavaScript unique in in comparison to Ruby, we will try to cover it off on that a little bit. But where it comes to the things where they are similar, you're expected to learn them on your own. And this also goes for kind of the rest of the program. Sort of the way it was that the program was designed is so that early on, you'd be like need a lot of like hand holding, like getting your way around like an array and things like that. And by React, it's a lot of like, you want to implement that, go ahead, Google it. And that's just a part of the process of being a developer. If you were in our AMA last week with Jordan and Megs, they both would have told you like Googling is most of what they do. So this is going to also, you're going to feel that for like the really first time. There's also a second thing. It's a crash course in debugging and code organization. So like it is going to be faster. I do want to like, before we go any further, try to keep up with it. If you can't keep up with it, let me know early. If something happens in your life in week 3 and you're like, I can't do this for 2 weeks, I want to know about that so I can flag it immediately. First off, because it means that like if like week 3, I know that like someone had something happen to them in their lives and like you're going to fall behind, I can flag that immediately to student services so that then if you like need to take a leave of absence at the end, we can be like, well, the student's been planning to take that since like week 3, rather than this student's taking a leave of absence intentionally to bail on their code review. And that's going to be helpful for me. So if you do fall behind, let me know. This is not a phase to fall behind it. Okay. Next, it's a crash course in debugging code organization. And for this, I think I'm going to show you all a video. And I'm going to regret it. I think, how do we feel about showing videos? It was very exciting when you were in elementary school, but now you know that it's like just a cop out for teachers not to teach things themselves. So I'm going to go do that really quickly. And it's going to tell you a little bit about the difference between Ruby and JavaScript. And one heads up, this is a funny video, but not nearly as funny as the audience is making it out to be. So I apologize in advance. They're going to be laughing a lot. This is going to be your first corporate retreat, really. But here we go. Let's share this. This is Gary Bernhardt, who's like a very clever and good speaker on coding. And this is a lecture on JavaScript, and you should let me know what's going on here. Let me know.
All right, good.
Audio working for everyone?
You guys know what WAT means? WAT. Exactly. Let's talk about Ruby. In Ruby, if you reference an undefined variable, of course it name errors, as you would expect. And if you try to assign B to A with them undefined, of course it name errors, as you would expect. And what happens if you try to assign A to A with A undefined? Nil. Correct. Nil. WAT. Let's talk about Ruby. Ruby, unlike some other dynamic languages, does not have bare words, so you cannot just type words in and have strings come out, unless you define a particular method missing that does the right thing. And then if you type bare words, suddenly Ruby supports bare words. And in fact, it will even support bare words with bangs in them. And this is not deserving of WAT. This is actually a result of how awesome Ruby is. But if you ever actually do this, then WAT. Let's talk about JavaScript. Does anyone know in JavaScript what array plus array is? Well, let me ask you this first. What should array plus array be?
Empty array.
Empty array, I would also accept type error. That is not what array plus array is. Wrong. Wrong. Array plus array is empty string. Obviously, I think that's obvious to everyone. Now, what would array plus object be? This should obviously be type error because those are completely disparate types. Does anyone know what this is? No. Close. No. Far away. It's object. Right. Nicely done. Now, of course, because this is plus, so you can flip the operands and the same thing comes out. So if we do, what? No, that's just an object. If you do object plus array, you should get exactly the same thing, which, as you can see, you do. And finally, the only one of these that's actually true is, because you add arrays, you get empty string, that doesn't make sense. But an object plus an object is actually not a number, technically. So this one's actually right. And exactly, right? Like, what is even going on in this lab? I don't even understand what person with a brain in their head would think that any of this is a good idea. Okay. Enough making fun of languages that suck. Let's talk about JavaScript. If I say array.new 16, or just array 16, I get an array of 16 things, which it represents as 16 commas, which is obvious. And if I then join those with a string, then I get the string 16 times. This is actually the only line in this entire presentation that's reasonable. Now, if I take that string and then add a 1 to it, it interprets the 1 as, or casts the 1 to a string, and then we get wat1 a bunch of times. Fine. Does anyone know what will happen if I subtract 1 from the string? I'm assuming no one does. I'll give you a hint. Does this help? Does anyone know? Wet man. That's all I got. Thank you, guys.
I promise there's a point to that. So yes, there is a lot of weird stuff that happens to JavaScript. Yeah, fair. We're missing some crouching, but if it helps, like, I could do that Dane Cook crouch as I like make points from now on. Yeah. So the reason I'm trying to show you that is you saw just how much work JavaScript just put into not erroring out there, right? That was one person doing a bit, where it's like adding a bunch of different types to each other and things that should clearly error, and JavaScript doesn't. This is a thing about JavaScript that was intentional at the outset, right? It was, hey, this is a script that we designed for beginners, or for people to just begin to be able to code on the internet. And we want your website to work and not error out just because things went poorly, right? We want to try our best to make it so that you don't have to follow best coding practices to make it work. In practice, it's kind of a monster. This is a tweet that I'm also going to share that I liked when I saw it in real life. This is kind of what JavaScript can feel like sometimes. The reason for this is because JavaScript is so afraid of erroring out. And it's so afraid of requiring different, of having code structure and different code organization. What will happen is a lot of times you'll be like, I'm going to write this line of code. And it'll be like, cool, you wrote it. Nothing changed. And you'll be cool, great. So I'm going to write my next 8 lines of code. And then around 8 lines later, something will break if you're lucky. And at that point you go, that's 8 lines where I have to figure out what went wrong. I have no idea why this number is now suddenly nil, or why this number is suddenly undefined, or something like that. And the reason is because JavaScript will just be like, oh, this is undefined. Good for you. And then just keep going. And this becomes something that will throw off new students a lot. In terms of one of the biggest first lessons of JavaScript that I can just desperately try to instill to all of you, it's whenever you write a line of code in JavaScript, console log out what the return statement was, or whatever you end up using with it, and make sure it's what you expect it to be. Whenever you're trying to pass variables around, console log those. Console logging is, for those of you who don't know what console logging means, because I haven't talked about it yet, it's the equivalent of a put statement, but in JavaScript. It'll print stuff out to the console for you, which makes it the easiest and quickest way to figure out what's going on with your code. There's also debugger, which works a lot like binding.pry, and a lot of students will end up using it a lot. It's very powerful. Sometimes it's like students will overuse it. Feel free to just console log things to check that they're working. I'm going to show you that a little bit later. But this is something that drives JavaScript students insane, because when you're early in learning a language and when you still don't know what most of the stuff means and you're trying one step at a time, it's hard to debug, right? Because there's a lot of assumptions that you can't rule out, like where you go ahead and say, I think this is how it works, but you're not certain. When you're an advanced developer, there's like a lot of opportunities for you to be like, okay, I know these 5 lines of code have to probably work, and I can like guess these 2 aren't the problem because they don't do this. When you're in early JavaScript, when you're new to it, everything's kind of new. So those 8 lines, you're going to be testing at each one individually. And that's going to take a lot of time, and it's going to be overwhelming, and you're going to wonder if you were doing this structurally the right way first. If you write 1 line of code at a time, console log in, and make sure that's what you expect, you never have to worry about this issue. And that makes you 1 step closer to not having to deal with this problem. Cool? So if I can give you one thing, it's code patiently. If you feel like you haven't checked something in over 30 seconds, or like in more than 2 lines of code, you're doing something wrong. You should feel a pit in your stomach when you haven't gotten enough feedback in a while. That's what a good developer does. They code slowly, but with a closed feedback loop that makes them code quicker. A closed feedback loop. So I'm going to go back here. It's also a crash course in code organization. In Rails, I taught you a lot about like, this is the MVC pattern. This is where all of your code belongs. This is where this piece of structure is, and this is the right way to write this. That was a lot of how we talked in Rails. We talked about convention. In JavaScript, there's no conventions. There are some basic clean code rules, right? They're like the clean code rules are universal, right? Single responsibility principle, making sure that that like your code is dry. Those sorts of things matter. But in JavaScript, you're going to be tempted to just code 1 line at a time to solve 1 problem at a time. And that's a good way to start. But eventually you'll get to a point where code organization becomes necessary, where it becomes like, hey, I shouldn't just be keeping these variables on the global scope. And JavaScript allows you to define functions inside of other functions. It allows you to define things inside, like variables inside of functions and then have them have their own scope and then call them somewhere else, but then use their original scope to get them. Some crazy stuff will happen with like when you like add this functional context and a bunch of other things that we're going to be teaching you. Pay attention, not just to how someone solved a problem, but if you can see it online, or when I do it or whatever, how that person organized their code. Pick up organizational patterns that work for you. I'm going to be coding something one way, one lecture, and then coding an entirely different way another lecture. And then other lecturers might code things entirely differently. I think recently everyone's been borrowing like my object-oriented approach to like how to build things once you get to like phase 5 or phase 6, or like week 5 or week 6, because I keep seeing students who keep having some elements of my JavaScript structure that I tend to use and then not using it. So I will hope to get other versions that aren't just my code, so I can show you. But other things you could do, you could go to Front End Mentor, and they have a lot of JavaScript challenges that then you could see everyone else's solution for and stuff like that. And these all become really good tools. Like just go to Twitter, go to email, like get to like some newsletters, just see how other people are coding JavaScript. It's one of those things where you'll learn. And so all together, this is also going to like be happening as I show you just enough to get by. JavaScript is like kind of a big learning curve, but like also just has a ton of material here. What I'm going to be showing you is JavaScript specifically for the DOM, for how to mess with things in the browser. I'm not going to be showing you how to build a server with JavaScript. I'm going to be showing you those tools. And I'm going to start by manipulating the DOM, and I'm going to skip over some of the weirder steps of JavaScript. And then we're going to go back and discuss a little bit of the weirdness around functions and stuff like that. So there's going to be points where we're using JavaScript that you haven't seen yet, and just try to get comfortable with that and ask me questions when you do. Cool. And part of that is that JavaScript is just so vast and everyone has their own opinions. This is another good bit, I think. But like you'll find this when you get to like when you start like applying for the job search, there's going to be a lot of opinions about how you should do JavaScript and things like that. A lot of it's all dumb. I'm going to be showing you what you need to know. Okay. But then last, why is JavaScript great? Every browser will run it for you. If I wanted to get my grandma to run my JavaScript code, like a script, I could get her to. It would be a little bit of work, right? I have to get on the phone. I'd have to be like, okay, you have to press Control Shift. Okay, no, you're yes, that's what that button is. And then you have to be like, okay, click the button that says console. Okay, copy and paste. And I would have to explain what copying and pasting is, but she would be able to do it, right? You can run JavaScript wherever, whenever you want, including on other people's web pages, which means you can hack other people's web pages if you'd like to. If you ever want to get past a paywall or something like that, you will usually be able to find something with JavaScript. I will show you some fun ways to hack. And also now everything's being developed in JavaScript. I'm going to briefly go into the history of JavaScript, and then I promise we will eventually get to the browser. But before I do, we might as well just, we haven't been in the browser for a while. So I'm just going to go over here, right? And I can just, in this page, right? I can go, you got, cool. We've got like a bunch of different things. I can just go right here into the console. I can start writing JavaScript. I can be like 0.1 plus 2, 3, const 3, const cheese equals 3. I can go ahead and say document.query selector h1. I bet that's an h1. Dot inner text equals and we can just start changing things, right? Cool. So JavaScript allows you to do a lot of cool things. It allows you to, like, if you ever want to be like, hey, I wonder how this like browser thing like accesses my phone camera or gets my location or looks at what I'm looking at or follows my cursor. That's all stuff you can do with JavaScript. There's like, I would just go ahead and take a look at the JavaScript APIs. I could probably, if I were a little bit less lazy in prepping this lecture, I could get it to go ahead and read out some code, some stuff right now and put text to speech. All of that stuff is stuff you can do with JavaScript. And all that stuff is available online for you. So basically every tool, you no longer just have to have a server that does anything. You can now basically run code anywhere that does anything. And that's kind of what makes JavaScript cool. It also is a lot more friendly now. There's a lot of worries about JavaScript. One heads up that I'm going to flag right in advance because I didn't already. When you're Googling material for for learning JavaScript, MDN and W3 schools are going to be great resources. Mozilla Developer Network is probably the best ongoing resource on JavaScript. What is going to be more frustrating for you is when you type into Google, how do I X in JavaScript? Because so many people for so long in their history of like coding in JavaScript have always used some sort of library to make coding in JavaScript slightly easier. You will not have access to those. You will not have access to jQuery because it's out of date. We're going to be coding in vanilla JavaScript to build single page web applications. Usually people stop short of doing that. Usually when people get to that point, they choose to use jQuery, or they choose to use Angular, or they choose to use Vue, or they choose to use React, which we're going to be learning next time. So you're going to get some weird stuff on Stack Overflow. If you see a $, that usually means they're trying to document query select or something in jQuery. It means that you're probably on the wrong page, unless you want to learn jQuery. The materials in the labs are going to be good explanations of the sorts of tools we're going to be using. But be careful around Stack Overflow. Be aware that we might not be going into as well documented territory as anything else, just because there have been so many ways to do everything in JavaScript throughout the years. So instead of showing you all of those ways, I'm going to be giving you the tools you need, and so are the labs, to like kind of navigate all of them. And what you're going to end up with is, if you do this phase correctly, you're going to end up being a really versatile JavaScript developer who can not only code React after next phase, but also when React eventually gets old, like every other JavaScript library has, that you'll be prepared for the next thing. And also because there's a lot of stuff that you need to do with JavaScript even when you're coding in React. The reason why there's so much JavaScript is, and I'm going to briefly go through this history, and then I promise you, I will code something today. But it was created in 10 days by a guy at Netscape. As, hey, we have all of this text on this new internet. What if we made it interactive some ways? It was created in 10 days by one dude. And that has some issues. Then what happened, if that wasn't enough, right? It was coded into, basically, this was produced by Netscape, right? And so Microsoft, which had Internet Explorer, was like, oh, they have a feature. We need that feature. So the people at Internet Explorer reverse engineered JavaScript, kinda, created JScript, which is their thing. And then they both co-developed, or they both independently developed their own features over the course of like 5 years, trying to outcompete the other. And then both had to like reverse engineer each other's features so that they would have a similar feature. So that's a lot of just random arbitrary stuff to be built into a code base. And because the internet was built on it, so like your like Space Jam website from 1995, right? If they went ahead and deprecate any of those features, it might crash. So they can't. So all of those features, all of those method functions that you have on the DOM and things like that, that were built in like 1997, still exist today. It was really, so this scared a lot of people away from JavaScript. It was a really broken language till the browser wars ended. And then the internet was broken because Internet Explorer established a dominance, reduced all of its budget to Internet Explorer. And that's why you had 30 toolbars on your Internet Explorer bar when you were in like 2004, and all of them had viruses. And then eventually Google was like, hey, so do you remember how like you used to get maps before Google Maps? Like you'd have like Netscape Navigator and would like load that specific location. And then if you want to go 500 pages right, you click like the right button, and that would reload the entire page with a new map. Google realized, hey, with JavaScript, we can just have them drag over this portion of the map, and then we just like show a loading spinner and then load it without refreshing the page, and it's going to be a way better user experience. And then Gmail, they were like, instead of having to like go to a new web page to compose a new email, it could just pop up. And after that, everyone started becoming obsessed with becoming JavaScript developers. And it was a huge pain in the ass until recently. there was a big move to standardize JavaScript. You're going to be hearing me talk about ECMAScript 2013. ECMAScript is the standard for JavaScript implementation. ECMAScript 2013, also known as ES6, did a ton to bring like class-oriented code and stuff like that into JavaScript so that things would work. And then people built transpilers specifically to make it so that you could write new JavaScript code, and then it'll translate it into old weird JavaScript code that your grandma's like Opera browser can run. Babel is a really common one. It comes built into React. You can actually see it right here. Okay, fine. We're gonna spoil some stuff. Babel, JS. It legitimately is just a transpiler that like you can like go ahead and write some weird old JavaScript code, and it'll go ahead and turn it, or like new JavaScript code, and it'll turn it into old JavaScript code for you. I guess now the browser compatible thing is still using const. But like it's like there's a lot of tools now to make it so that you no longer have to worry about like writing your JavaScript to work with an ancient website. So there's a lot we're starting to be able to do. It's a really exciting place to develop. People keep building ways to make it easier. And if you stay in the know, you have an entire front-end development career just by following Twitter trends and being like, oh, I guess I could try to implement that technology and stuff like that. Going to meetups and stuff like that. So it's awesome. JavaScript is one of 3 pillars of web development. We've talked about HTML and CSS. JavaScript is the third. In it, there are 3 principles that I'm going to be teaching you. 1, DOM manipulation, the ability to use JavaScript to manipulate what's on the browser, what's being shown in the browser. Event listeners, which allows us to set up opportunities for interactivity and server communications through asynchronous JavaScript and XML, just AJAX, or as we're going to be talking about, fetch, async await, some way to make a network request from your browser to be like, hey, while you're on this web page, have this web page go ask this API or this other web page for this data, and then start rendering it out. That's going to be how we end up building stuff. Eventually, what we're going to be building towards, and I'm not going to start with this right away, is having one single page, and this is going to be the requirement for the app, for the browser, or for your phase, that doesn't refresh, that then basically emulates a whole website and has a bunch of different features that we can use. And like as you click, it does different things. And as we get to React, we're going to go even further, where we'll have like React Router and things that manipulate the URL bar. So it really does feel like you're moving somewhere else, and like the back buttons will work. But what it's really just going to be is JavaScript reloading stuff for you. When we get to the DOM, does anyone know what I mean by the DOM? That's a very good question. I did when I was in the program. My project was a side scroller shooter that I will teach you all how to make a video game at some point. That is an optional lecture that I have co-created with the person who's now head of curriculum. I've been teaching it for a long time. I just don't think you should be able to leave JavaScript without at least having seen a video game being made. And we'll have some fun with that. But yes, as long as you have a has many and belongs to relationship somewhere in your project, you can totally have a side scroller game. Cool. So does anyone know what the DOM is though?
It's what's displayed on the web page and all the elements, and it looks like HTML when you open it up on the inspect button.
That's a really good answer. Yeah, it's the document object model. And what this means is it's an object-oriented representation of a web page. So the document is going to be the HTML. The object model is going to be how we interpret and understand that HTML. So I think at this point, I've talked way too much about code, right? We're going to actually hop into what is going to be our page for the next couple weeks. I'm going to be doing a lot of JavaScript in here. Yeah, it's going to happen. So you can see right now, this is all HTML and CSS, right? None of these buttons work yet. This button definitely doesn't work. You can go and watch Jason Derulo as Rum Tum Tugger here, because that's just some embedded YouTube link. And at this point, we can begin talking about it. Cool. So right now, one thing that I just want you to, first off, I'm going to have a lot of error messages as we do this, because I have 2 ad blockers that YouTube keeps complaining about. But I'm just going to clear it. Yeah, I agree here. I think we can build out the official fan page. Yeah, so right here, if we take a look at, first off, if you're ever coding in JavaScript, ever, whatever you're doing, console stays open. Cool? Just do that. Don't forget that your console exists. Your console is where your errors will be. You will never get a blinking red light saying this is broken. You'll never get redirected to a record not found page. Instead, it'll just throw some red lights up in here, and you'll have to figure out what they mean. But it's also where you can put your own data as you keep coding. If you want to see what your app looks like in full screen, feel free to go like this temporarily, or you can close it, but please bring it back up. Okay? There's so many times where I've worked with students and it's just like, hey, so what's your error? And they're like, I don't know, it's not showing up. And I'm like, what does your console say? And it's like, oh, it has the exact description of what the error is right there. Please don't be that person, because it's your hours that you're wasting trying to do it. Have the console open. The Chrome console is also awesome. You can imagine what it looks like in mobile. Clearly, my app is optimized for mobile. But there's a lot of stuff we can do here. So, George is correct. So right here, I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to show you right now. This is the HTML representing the document, right? So this is the document itself. Right now, it's rendered in a cool way by Google. Google went ahead and indented it for us, right? If we want to see the actual just document, it looks like this. Cool. But one thing about how it works under the hood, and why we call it the DOM, or the document object model, is what what your browser interprets this as is not just some random tags, right? But actually a bunch of each element is its own sort of object. When I say object as a developer, one thing you should be thinking of is a template for interpreting both data and behaviors, or for holding both data and behaviors. So for example, we would create a cat class that would have instances of cats that you'd be able to call the .name method on when we were in our previous cohort, when we were in Rails. And that would store the name, right? But then you could also have a different method that did a different thing. So you'd have both the name, which was stored, you'd have the ability to access it with a method. And so we're thinking of those in terms of data and behaviors. And what it really is, when we talk about the DOM, we're talking about a list, like a tree. And a lot of people refer to it as the DOM tree, where at the top you have the body, or the document. And inside you have a bunch of children that are like nav, header, main, aside, things like that. And each of those have their own children. They're all considered like branches on a tree. So they're referred to as a tree because this is a very common data structure when you're coding, of just having list of things that all have children and stuff like that. So the DOM tree allows us to do a few different things. First off, if I call document, this is going to be a useful thing to know about. The document is obviously the HTML representing the document. If I call it, it's like, hey, it's an HTML element, right? And it's going, but it actually has way more than just the HTML. So I can console log document, and I'll get the same thing. And it's going to like print out the exact same thing and then show me undefined. Console log like puts returns undefined. But console.dir is just another little tool that shows you everything about this like this object that you're looking at. I'm going to call that a document. And you're going to see that it actually keeps track of way more than just this HTML stuff. You have here, you can call the URL from what's that's on. You can like take a look at every element. You can go ahead and like ask for the forms. There's a ton of things you can do here. You can like look at last child. You can like see all the event listeners that are plugged in, right? So there's a lot of behaviors here. And I can just go ahead right here and I can see like, oh, there's document title in here. So I'm just gonna go ahead and just do like document.title equals lol hack the planet. And you'll see over here now we have hack the planet over here. Cool. So notice that it's not just an item. It's also like, it's not just HTML. It's also has a ton of behaviors and it has a bunch of functions. So to show you an example, right? One thing you're going to be using a lot in JavaScript is this function called query selector that you can call on any element on a web page. You can call it on the document. You can call it on something in the document, right? So I'm just going to go ahead. I'm going to say document.query selector h1. And now what query selector takes in the string is a CSS selector. The basics of CSS selecting. Let's go ahead and let's take a look at some elements, right? You can call any tag. It'll grab you the first tag that matches by the tag, right? Query selector will always give you the first element that matches what you described. So if you have an H1 here, all you need to write is H1 in quotes. If I wanted the main, I would write main in quotes. Here I'm grabbing this H1. Cool. Next, but like then there's also ways you can access things by a couple of other things. The most common other selectors are the class and the ID. To select something by an ID, we can go ahead and in this case we have main image. Use a hash symbol to represent that it is an ID. Cool. The hash represents an ID. With a class, let's see if we can find a class here. We have class uninvited right here for this button, right? You can go ahead and say dot uninvited. You can also use much more advanced selectors. You can select things by, oh yeah. Cool, is that good? Cool. So, rip everyone's eyesight. Cool. So right here, this goes ahead and it gives you a lot of different like options for selection. If you want to learn more about CSS selecting, I would recommend a game called CSS Diner. Just Google it. It's great for learning how to select things in CSS. There's also, if you're feeling really lazy and you need to know exactly how to select something, you can always just copy selector from by right-clicking on something right here. Don't grow to learn this. This is something to do when you're desperate or when you're hacking something. Like there will be a case where you're like, hey, this advertisement is trying its best not to be selected. How do I do that? If you're ever like doing something like that. And then you can, and then this will be helpful. So this is going to go ahead and say, hey, a footer that's a child of body that has an iframe, right? We can also like chain these, right? Document.query selector works, and this actually works completely. But if I want to be really annoying, right, we can start with like document.query selector footer, right? This is going to give me the first footer that matches. And then after that, we can go to query selector iframe. So remember, query selector is going to return the element, right? So then you can just keep chaining things on. Query selector, and it's one thing that I don't think other people, enough other people teach. Query selector has an inverse. Query selector will search down the tree into all of the children for the first element that matches by CSS. The reason I'm talking about query selector, I should probably like explain why, right? It's because it's super useful to be able to grab an element from the DOM so you can remove Jason Derulo at a moment's notice. Yeah. What I just did here was I just called .remove on it. Just some JavaScript that you now know. You now know that elements have a .remove. Also, one last thing. Whoops. Oh no. We can go back to the network tab. We're going to be learning a little bit more about that, right? We go ahead, we do document query selector iframe, right? What happens if I call .remove like this? Anyone know? Everybody's right like this.
You get an error, right?
Wouldn't necessarily get an error. I wouldn't remove it either, though. I would just get this function. What this is always saying, and I'm going to show you this because this is one of the big differences between Ruby and JavaScript. And I realize this is a kind of free form lecture where it's like sometimes I drop truth bombs and sometimes I'm just ranting about the history of JavaScript. If you ever get this, this is because Ruby is different than JavaScript in that when you write the name of a function in Ruby, you invoke it. When you write the name of a function in JavaScript, you do not. You just simply give its definition. This is what allows us to pass functions around, right? So I'm going to go ahead. So like if I wanted to use it, I would have to use these close parentheses to go ahead and say, and then run it. Cool. And now it's gone. We should query select something else. Document.query selector H1. Dots. And then I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to say dot inner text. Or no, let's go ahead and say dot remove right here. But I'm not going to invoke it. The reason why this is important. Yeah, go ahead, Naomi.
So the function that you just said, can you explain it in more simpler terms? Because I don't quite understand.
Yeah, so parentheses are what we need to invoke the function to make it run, right? We go ahead and say run this function when we put parentheses next to it. Cool?
So
We're going-
why would you do dot remove?
Without the parentheses? I'm about to show you why, right?
Okay.
So here, I can now go ahead and say, I'm going to set this equal to a variable right here. Cool. And now to get really cheeky, you can just go ahead and call. Uh-oh. Interesting. I totally thought this would work. I might have to like demonstrate something slightly different to make this work. But eventually what this is going to allow you to do, not using the parentheses, is going to allow you to pass around functions to save them for later, right? For example, I could have document.query selector. I'm trying to like use this using only stuff that we already know. Eventually, right? I'm going to like define a function right here called like function remove h1. Cool. And here, inside of here, I'm going to go ahead and say this bad boy right here. So here you notice it has the parentheses. So when I run remove h1, it'll work, right? But say I don't want to immediately run the function. There's other things I can do with the function instead of running them. Hello?
Hey, how's it going?
I got you, Josh. Cool. So right now we have this function called remove h1. You might want to invoke it right away. And you could invoke it by doing this, which I'm not going to do because I want my h1, right? But there's other things you might want to do with this function. For example, eventually I'm going to show you or let's go ahead and do document.query selector h1. Let's grab this h1 add event listener to the document. No worries. And I'm going to go ahead and say, hey, when you click this, remove h1. So I'm saying here is for this h1, wait for it to be clicked. And this is going to be what we're discussing next week, event listeners, right? And then use this function. Now, if I had written this function right here with parentheses, JavaScript would have read it from left to right, been like, click, cool, that's a string, I know what this is. And then would see remove h1 with parentheses. So then would invoke it in place and use the return statement here as my actual, as the actual function for the click. So what would happen is if I did this the wrong way, so right now this works. If I click this right here, it goes away. Yeah. So I'm saying save this function for later, but when you do invoke it, use this function is what I'm basically saying. If I do this again, right? But I go ahead, oops, come on. But I go ahead and this time I use parentheses here. What'll happen is as I'm creating this event listener, it immediately removes it. And then whenever I click on it, first off, it doesn't matter because it's gone. But secondly, it would be undefined here. So saying with using the parentheses says run it, right? Not using the parentheses is hold on to it. So when you say run it, you get its return statement. Naomi, go ahead.
So you're pretty much saying once you click it, it'll remove it.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you refresh the page, it'll come back.
Yeah. Oh, so all of this is that I'm doing right here in the console. This is a very important point. Everything I do in the console will be gone on page refresh. Otherwise, the internet would be completely broken. Right? Like, because I can edit Wikipedia on my own browser, right? And I can be like, hey, I want this, or I want this to like now have this bad boy. I want to get selector, right? Right? If I did this, right? I'm modifying this purely on my browser right now. I'm not modifying any code. I'm not telling destroyallsoftware.com to update its server to update the file so that now this says what, right? I'm instead just updating my browser's view of it. That's what you're doing in the console. So console becomes a really good tool for testing things out. But eventually I would move it into your own JavaScript file, which I'm going to be showing you in a bit. But the more important thing right here is that, yeah. So that's really important, right? This is like, we're not hacking Destroy All Software right here. We're just hacking our like browser's view of it, right? So if I go ahead and I now have this like new, it's not like editing Wikipedia. Editing Wikipedia means everyone else sees it, right? JavaScript is just, I can run, like this is loaded on my computer and I can edit it any way I want, right? So, but that's only for me, right? And that doesn't change any of the files regarding it. It only updates how my browser sees it. I will show you what it means, like how we can make that work in a second. Yeah, awesome. Cool. So let's go ahead and let's create a new function really quickly. Just like really show you what I mean here. And we're going to learn a little bit more about this later. Document a query selector h1 dot inner text plus equals exclamation point. What this does is it adds an exclamation point to my inner text right here. Cool. Inner text is going to be a tool we're going to be using a bunch. I'm going to be showing you it a bunch more times. I'm just doing this to demonstrate some of the basic principles of JavaScript. Eventually, this function I can use in a bunch of different ways, right? This is invoking it by just using the parentheses. Say, run this once. I can, instead of invoking it, though, I can go ahead and say, document query selector h1 dot add event listener hover. I think hover is the one. Make exciting, right? And then, nope, I might be wrong. I'll just go back to click. Right now, whenever I click it, I'm adding an exclamation point to it, right? I can also, if I'm just, yeah, there we go. Yeah, that's right. Cool. I can also go ahead and pass this definition, which once again, notice I'm not using the parentheses, right? I can pass this. I can go ahead and say, hey, document dot set interval. And then if I'm remembering correctly, make exciting 1000. Or is it just set interval? Yeah, there we go. And now every second it's adding an exclamation point. So the reason JavaScript is a little bit different than Ruby. In Ruby, we basically invoke functions when we either define the functions or we're invoking the functions, right? In JavaScript, you're actually passing around functions a whole lot. We are not just saying, hey, define this function, invoke it. We're also saying, hey, this function should use this other function in this particular way, right? So when we're using parentheses, we're saying invoke this function. When we're not using parentheses, we're saying, here's this function for you to invoke later. And that's going to be a big difference as we implement things. And it's going to be something that you'll eventually become really clear with. And it's important to understanding how JavaScript works. Cool. But there's other things we can do, right? I'm going to clear this again. Clear. Eventually, I should just like have a variable for document.query selector h1. Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. Const title equals document.query selector h1. You can use this to like do document title.style. Every element has its own style, right? And here you can go ahead and say background color equals blue. And then suddenly it's blue. Color equals red. Now it's red. You'll see if we go to the title now in our actual HTML, it'll have changed our HTML somewhat, I think. Yeah, now it has some inline styling right here. It didn't update our CSS. It just went ahead and just passed those right in. Cool. Just stuff you can do in JavaScript. And this is what we mean by the document object model. I can just go ahead and access the style. And then like, I could like give it like change it using its behaviors being like style.background color equals something, right? And then it'll go ahead and add that to the document for me and keep track of it. Cool. So the last thing I'm going to show you, and then we're going to do like one brief thing, right? Because I realize this is the broad overview, but I really want to like make sure we understand what's going on when we talk about JavaScript. Gotta clear this, right? And I should show you how to write JavaScript now, because this all works in the console. And when you're developing a solution to something, my advice, always start coding or usually start coding in the console. When you're coding something together, when you're being like, hey, I want to add this feature to this page, when you're doing a lab, start working in the console and then eventually transition it over to your actual code. When you like test something and it works. Cool. But I'm going to show you how to do that now. So there's a couple ways we can write JavaScript. The first is we can go ahead and we can say, where'd my code go? All right, I'm going to move this over. That was the least efficient way I could have done that. Cool. So right now we have the code right here, this index.html, right? So in JavaScript, there's a function called alert, right? Which just goes ahead and gives the pop-up. Cool. Y'all see that? Alert with a string of hello. Cool, that works, right? Couple ways you can write JavaScript. You can write inline JavaScript. This is annoying, a little silly way to do it, right? This can sometimes help. Alert. Hello, right? And now when I refresh the page, we get hello, and then everything loads, which is crazy. We got the hello before everything loaded. It waited for us to hit this okay. You notice that? That's going to be important in a second. This hello happened before anything loaded on the DOM. I'm going to show you why that's important in a second. So that's one way to do it, right? We can also go ahead and say, let's turn this into a console log. Hello, right? So now we get this hello right here, right? And then right here, so like you can go ahead and write scripts right here. Or alternatively, the way that you're probably going to be writing your scripts is to have a source, which I'm hopefully doing correctly. It's been a while. There we go. And right here, what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm just going to create a new file. Index.js, right? And we can be more like, we can go ahead and put this into assets, right? We can go ahead and say assets slash dot slash asset slash index.js. Do we need a little bit of a review on relative file structures? Dot means this is the folder you're in. Slash assets means go into the folder. Assets. Dot dot would mean go out of this folder and go back one. And then we can go to index.js. And here I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to write console.log hello. Cool. Then we get our hello right here. Cool. So now the next thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and I want to say, hey, I do want an exclamation point on the H1. Plus equals is short for equals that same thing plus this new thing in JavaScript. So I'm going to check that this works. Cool, this code works. I now know that this works. There's no chance of this erroring out. So I'm going to go ahead and put this in my JavaScript code. Boop. Cool. And I should definitely see an exclamation point in this new window. For those of you who have taken this mod or phase before, who think you have the answer, feel free to keep it to yourself smugly or give me like a little thumbs up to like if you really want to like emphasize, hey, I've got this. I know what's going to happen, because there is going to be an error. You can tell by the fact that I keep saying there's not going to be an error. So right now I said document.querySelector h1.innerText plus equals exclamation point. I just demonstrated that this worked. And I demonstrated also that this file is loading because we console logged hello. If I refresh the page, we get an error. It says cannot read property inner text of null. For those of you who, for anyone, what is it saying is null?
Because in it's null, there's not a, it's not equalized. It's not giving a value before.
Yeah, so this is turning into null. So I can't call inner text on it, right? This is what it's saying is null, right? Cannot read property inner text of null right here. Now, I'm going to copy this again just to prove to you that I'm not insane that this code works, right? What? Why does that work now when it couldn't work a second ago? Why is it saying that H1 was null when I ran this code, right? But now that I'm running it in the console, it's saying that H1 isn't null and it's adding that exclamation point regardless. Anyone have any ideas? declaring document, you don't have to declare document. That's going to be part of it, right? George is correct there. If we go ahead and add an alert right here. Jeez. We'll see what's going on. Bloop. Oops. We will. Or it'll fail, right? And then not ignore me completely. Can I just do this? Oh, it's fully failing right here. Point is, yes, our script is loading before H1 is loaded. So it's going to go ahead and run this code, and then it's going to load my HTML. So this is the first, or like maybe the second or third thing that is going to be a common pitfall when you're developing that will happen to you maybe on the code review, depending on your actual project. You can't just run JS from the script file at the outset. That requires you to access things at the DOM. Instead, there are 3 solutions to this that are all pretty cool. The 2 newer ones. You used to have to write script in your head. You don't have to anymore. You can just write it at the bottom. Cool. I guess I had already done that here. There's a little bit of a snarky approach, but it'll go ahead and it will successfully add that exclamation point for us. Cool. More recently, I think this is ES6. You can just put the word defer right here, and then it'll wait for your DOM to load. Cool. You get this exclamation point. Naomi, what's up?
So it doesn't matter on which line you put the script.
Well,
You
it
just
does.
load the same way.
It definitely does, right? Because here, this didn't work, right? We don't have an exclamation point. Here, this totally does. Right? So
Oh,
this
I
is,
see.
yeah, this is the first quick solution, right? But it's the one I would recommend the least of the 3 I'm about to show you. First off, it's nice to have all of your scripts in your head. It tells other developers what you're doing. It tells people where the sources are. So defer goes ahead and says, hey, wait for this to load. If you write this, this is a new ES6 way of doing it. You will also see a lot in like code that you see around that instead of doing any of this, people do document.add event listener, which I'm getting to tomorrow or next week. There's an event listener that waits to trigger it until DOM content loaded, right? So here you can go ahead and write an anonymous function if you'd like. Or, and then like go in here and do this. An anonymous function is something I'm going to get to in a while. And you'll notice that there's an exclamation point. Anonymous function is basically just in JavaScript, since it's so useful to define functions without having to use them. And there's so many times when you just need to pass in a function, but be like, don't use this yet, right? There's actually ways to go ahead and say like, hey, here's a function that I'll never have to use again, so I don't feel like creating my own function for it, right? But it looks like this. But like, this is what that function is. You can also do this, and this is the older way of doing it. Boop. Also works. Or we can go ahead and here do function app. When DOM content loads, run the function of app. And then you code all of your code inside this one function, which is normal. This is a normal thing JavaScript developers do. You're going to write tons of functions inside this function. That's crazy. JavaScript developers are insane. But it's a normal thing. And this is going to go ahead and still work. What we're doing right here is we're defining, you're noticing also function. I'm just defining it right here calling it up here. That's crazy, right? Functions and vars, which is why we don't use vars, get read before anything else. So JavaScript will run through your code, move function app to the top of your code to like define it so that you can use it before you've actually defined it. It's something called hoisting that I'm going to discuss in a lot more detail, maybe at some point. But basically how it works is you'd be like var cheese equals what? Console.log cheese defined before var cheese. So you'll notice I had an undefined, not if I type swag, right? It's gonna be like, hey, this is an error, swag isn't defined. In this case, it's not saying it's var is undefined. It's saying, or var is not defined. It's saying it's undefined, which is slightly different. It doesn't throw an error. It just says, hey, this is equal to undefined. And then afterwards it becomes what? What it's really doing is what it's really doing when you do this is you're saying var cheese and then cheese equals what? That's what JavaScript does for you. It goes, oh, I saw a var down there. Better bring it up to the top so it's never errors out. And then down here, it finally defines what it's supposed to be. It's a crazy thing. It's called hoisting. It's why we don't use var because it is so unpredictable. To like have something get weirdly defined before it's defined, but then change in its definition depending on when it's defined. Functions, though, we do that. Function, anything where you write the word function, it's going to hoist it to the top of your app so you can invoke it anywhere. But you can just go ahead and invoke it here, right? I can go ahead and say app right here, and we're going to get 2 exclamation points. I think. Wait, nope. I'm wrong. I'm wrong because we're waiting for the DOM content to load. If I went ahead and used defer instead, this will go ahead and work. Oop. We now have 2 exclamation points, both happening before app is defined. No. In terms of best practice to write functions or to organize your code, I'm going to go ahead and say, eventually we're going to be talking a lot more about it. There's a lot of conventions and or a lot of thoughts that go into it. My basic advice is that good code reads like an essay, in that it starts with your main description of what your app does. And then we'll talk about that in a second. And then eventually it gets down to like the nitty gritty details. So you should be able to open up an app and kind of see how it's structured and what it's doing from the first few lines of code you read. Var, so okay, eventually you're going to have a lab on var, let, and const. Let is how we define variables. So in Ruby, we would define variables by being like cheese equals swag, right? And you can do this in JavaScript, but it's bad. It defines this big global variable that you can't, that does weird stuff. Instead, when we define variables, if we want them to stay constant, Batman will now always be Robin, right? We can't have Batman. We can't change Batman because we have it as constant. If you want to have a variable that you want to remain something you can change, you use let. Var, let, and const are all ways of defining variables. Are all ways of defining variables. In Ruby, you would just say variable equals this. In JavaScript, you have to be more specific. And I wouldn't recommend using var. Console log, on the other hand, returns undefined. So it's really just there to print stuff into your console for you. It's not there to like change stuff on the DOM. If you're changing something inside of a console log, it means you're doing something wrong. It's there to check to see where things are. So there's a couple things that I do want to dive into, but I think this goes ahead and discussing most of what I want to do. So what I want to do for the last 5 minutes instead is I'm going to break you all up into groups of 4 until 7:30, maybe 5, because I don't know how many of you are still here. And then what I want you to do is just go to some random website, have someone go to a random website, share their screen, and I want them to begin manipulating the DOM. Cool? And like you just mess with some website, make it do something weird, and then we're going to talk about it for about 2 minutes when you get back. Cool? All right. We're recording again, and everyone should be back. This isn't gonna take too long. Just how was it, everyone?
Good.
I kind of
Interesting.
like, yeah, it was really interesting. It was like kind of difficult. We forgot, like, we was able to pick out like the A tags. So our group did like Google, and we did like the nav bar about and all that. And we set it to var, and we set it to some random name, and then we did document dot query selector, and that's kind of all we got.
Yeah. So like a lot of students come out of this lecture, and they go ahead and they go right to the New York Times, and they like go ahead and change one of the headlines to be like, their friend's name is a big loser, and then like a picture of them. So feel free to go ahead and do that before it gets boring or before JavaScript gets so difficult that all the joy gets gone. But this is something you can just do forever now. If you ever want to like forward a tweet, if you ever want to send some fake news out into the world, that is something you now have the ability to do in their CSS style. You don't need to open up Photoshop. And we're going to be learning a lot more cool, awful things you can do with JavaScript too. So thank you for the patience. I know this was a presentation heavy lecture. We will do a lot of coding in the future. But great job, everyone. And it's great to meet everyone who's just joining. Cool.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Later, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, Nikki. Have a good one.
You too.